I have a son who owns $10 million, dollars, and he abandoned me in the hospital alone, without a call, without a penny. But my daughter, who had nothing but love, sold her only car to save my life. And then, from the land the whole family abandoned, fate decides who deserves to receive it all back. If you're watching this story, please like and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. And don't leave, because the ending will leave you speechless. I used to be somebody. I know how that sounds, like the opening line of a sad country song, or something a broken old man mutters into his coffee while the diner fills up around him. But it's the truth, and I've spent enough years flinching away from the truth that I've earned the right to say it plain. My name is Walter Bennett. I'm 59 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have been nobody to the people who were supposed to love me most. I grew up in Abilene, Texas, the son of a hardware store owner who believed in two things: honest work and land. Paper money comes and goes, my father used to say, pressing his thumb into the red clay soil of our backyard like he was taking its pulse. But land stays. Land remembers you even after you forget yourself. I carried that belief into adulthood the way some men carry a pocket knife. Always there, always trusted, rarely questioned. By the time I was 35, I had bought and sold enough property to call myself a real estate investor, without embarrassing myself at a dinner table. Nothing extravagant. Modest subdivisions outside of Midland, a commercial strip near the highway that I flipped twice in 3 years, a few residential lots in neighborhoods that were just beginning to turn. I wasn't wealthy, but I was steady, and in Texas, steady counts for something. Diana and I had been married for 12 years by then. We met at a county fair when I was 23, and she was wearing a yellow dress and arguing with a game booth operator about a rigged ring toss. I fell in love with her stubbornness before I fell in love with her. Ethan was born a year after our wedding. Claire came 4 years later, quieter from the start, the kind of child who watched everything with those serious gray eyes and never asked for more than she needed. We were not a perfect family. I don't think perfect families actually exist outside of greeting card commercials. But we were functional. We had a kitchen table where we ate together most nights. We had arguments that ended before bedtime mostly. We had a life that felt like it was building towards something. And then I bought the 70 acres outside of Odessa, and everything I had built started coming apart at the seams. The property looked like a gold mine when I first walked it. 70 acres of West Texas scrubland, flat and open, sitting at the edge of what every projection in 2009 suggested would become a major commercial corridor within 5 years. The seller was motivated, a widow whose late husband had held the land for decades and left her drowning in property taxes. I paid $340,000 for it, nearly everything I had liquid, and I borrowed the rest against 2 other properties I owned. I told Diana it was the smartest investment I'd ever made. She looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I didn't know how to read back then. "You've said that before," she said. "This time I mean it differently." She went back to her magazine. Ethan, who was 16 and already carrying himself like a man who had decided he was smarter than everyone in the room, looked up from his phone long enough to say, "Sounds risky, Dad," like he was 40 years old and had read a book about financial management. I should have paid attention to the silence that followed. I didn't. What came next was not dramatic in the way disasters usually are in movies. There was no single phone call, no sudden collapse. It was slower than that, and slower is always worse, because slower means you have time to hope it might still turn around before the floor finally gives out underneath you. 18 months after I closed on the property, an environmental assessment flagged the land. Old industrial runoff from a facility that had operated 3 miles north of the parcel in the 1970s had migrated through the soil and groundwater in ways that nobody had mapped until a new county survey caught it. The land was not dangerously toxic. Nobody was in immediate danger. But it was legally compromised. Development permits were frozen. No bank would touch it. No buyer would come near it. The property that was supposed to make our future became a 70-acre anchor pulling me straight to the bottom. I spent the next 2 years trying to fight it. I hired environmental consultants, filed appeals, attended county commission meetings where I sat in folding chairs under fluorescent lights, and explained my situation to people who nodded sympathetically and did nothing. I borrowed against everything I still owned to cover the carrying costs on the Odessa land. And one by one, like lights going out in a house, my other properties went too. Sold at a loss, surrendered to lenders, or just quietly abandoned when I ran out of the energy to fight for them. By the time Ethan was 20 and leaving for college on the scholarship he'd earned, and I was genuinely proud of him for that. I want to be clear about that. We were living in a house in San Angelo that I wasn't sure I could keep. Diana had gone back to work at a travel agency. The pride in her face when she told people about Ethan's scholarship was real. The way she stopped mentioning what I did for a living was also real. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I had run out of things to say. The years between 40 and 59 are not years I can recount cleanly because they blur together the way bad weather blurs a landscape. There were good stretches. A small contracting job here, a property consultation there, enough to keep the lights on. Diana and I stopped fighting loudly and started fighting quietly, which is its own kind of worse. Ethan graduated, found work in Dallas, climbed fast. He had his mother's sharpness and a salesman's confidence, and the particular hunger of a man who grew up watching his father fail and decided that would never be him. Claire became a teacher. Elementary school, 3rd grade, in a district outside of Fort Worth. She called me every Sunday, which is more than I deserved. She asked about my knee, which had been giving me trouble, and she remembered to ask about the neighbor's dog that kept digging under my fence. And she sent me a card on my birthday that she'd made herself with watercolor markers, the kind her students used. I kept that card in the kitchen drawer next to the phone charger. I looked at it sometimes when the house felt too quiet. Ethan called on holidays, briefly, and always managed to mention within the first 3 minutes what his current income was, what his apartment in uptown Dallas looked like, what conference he had just attended. I learned to say, "That's great, son," in a tone that closed the subject without sounding wounded. Diana had made her peace with our life in a way that I think required her to make a certain kind of peace with me, too. The kind where you stop expecting anything and find that easier to live with than disappointment. We shared a house. We were polite. That's not nothing. But it's also not the yellow dress and the ring toss argument, and some nights I sat on the back porch and thought about the distance between those two things for longer than was good for me. The cough started in February. At first I thought it was just the dry Texas winter, the kind of air that sandpapers your throat if you spend too much time outside. I ignored it for 6 weeks, which I now understand is what men my age do, because we have been trained since boyhood to treat our bodies like machines that should simply keep running until they don't. When the cough started producing blood, just a little, just once, and then a second time a week later, I drove myself to the clinic on Route 87 and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours reading a magazine from 2022. The doctor's name was Patel, young, careful, the kind of physician who writes everything down before he says anything. He ordered a chest x-ray and then a CT scan, and he called me back 3 days later with that particular tone in his voice that doctors use when they are organizing the kindness required to deliver bad news. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "there's a mass in your left lung. We need to do a biopsy, but the imaging is concerning." I sat in his office and looked at the diagram he'd drawn on a notepad. A rough sketch of 2 lungs, a small circle drawn in the left one. Such a small circle for such a large problem. "What are we talking about timeline-wise?" I asked. "We need the biopsy first, but if this is what I think it is, we're talking about surgery relatively quickly. The sooner the better." "And cost?" He paused. "That's going to depend on your insurance coverage, and I don't have insurance," I said. "I let it lapse 8 months ago. I couldn't keep up with the premiums." He wrote something down. He was very careful with his expression. I appreciated that. When I got home that evening, Diana was in the kitchen making dinner. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her stir something on the stove, and I thought about how to say what I needed to say. "I need to talk to you," I said. She turned around. Something in my face must have told her this wasn't the usual variety of difficult conversation, because she turned the burner down and actually faced me, which she hadn't done in a while. I told her about the mass, about the biopsy, about the money. She listened. She was very still. When I finished, she set the wooden spoon down on the counter and said, "How much?" Surgery alone could be 60, 70,000, maybe more if there are complications. I don't know yet. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "You should call Ethan." Not "we should call Ethan." You should call Ethan. That small pronoun said everything. I waited 3 days to make that call. I want to be honest about that. I waited because I was afraid. And I am not a man who has ever found it easy to admit that fear comes in flavors. And the worst flavor is the one where you're afraid of your own child. When I finally dialed Ethan's number, it was a Thursday evening. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Dad!" Distracted. I could hear background noise, restaurant sounds, low music, glasses. "Are you somewhere? I can call back." "No, it's fine. Client dinner just wrapped up. What's going on?" I told him about the lung, about the biopsy which had come back the day before confirming what Dr. Patel had suspected, about the surgery timeline, the cost, the gap between what I had and what I needed. There was a pause on his end. I had been in enough business negotiations in my life to recognize the shape of that pause, someone calculating, repositioning. "Dad," Ethan said, and his voice had shifted into something careful and practiced. "I'm sorry to hear about the health situation. I really am. But I think you need to understand that I've worked very hard to get where I am, and the financial position I'm in now." "Ethan," I said his name quietly, just that, "is not something I can just dip into every time. Son, I'm asking for help with surgery. I might die without it." Another pause, shorter this time. "Your mistakes are not my responsibility anymore," he said. "You made choices, bad ones, for years. And I spent a lot of my life dealing with the consequences of those choices. I'm not doing that again." I sat with the phone against my ear for another few seconds after he finished. "Okay," I said, and I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time after that call. Diana was in the other room. She didn't come out, which meant she'd heard the conversation, or at least enough of it, and had decided that the safest thing to do was to stay where she was. Outside, the sun was going down over the flat Texas scrub, turning the sky that particular shade of bruised orange that only happens in West Texas, and I thought about my father pressing his thumb into the soil and saying that land remembers you even after you forget yourself. I thought about what it meant to be forgotten by the people you made, and then I picked up the phone and called the one person I had promised myself I wouldn't burden. Claire answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she'd been waiting. "Dad?" Her voice was immediate, warm, real in a way that Ethan's had stopped being a long time ago. "Hey, it's late for you to be calling. Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth to say yes, the way I always had, the protective lie I'd been telling for years to keep her from worrying. But something in me was just too tired to tell it one more time. "No, baby," I said. "It's not." The silence after I said those 3 words, "It's not okay," lasted maybe 4 seconds. But I have replayed those 4 seconds more times than I can count, because in them I heard something shift on Claire's end of the line. Not panic. Something steadier than panic. The sound of a person gathering themselves. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I sat at that kitchen table in the dark. I hadn't bothered to turn on the overhead light, and I don't know why, maybe because the dark felt appropriate. And I told my daughter everything I had been carrying for 3 weeks. The cough. The clinic. Dr. Patel's careful voice. The biopsy results. The number the hospital financial coordinator had quoted me with the same flat professionalism you'd use to read a weather report. $68,000 minimum, barring complications. Possibly more. I told her about Ethan, too. I hadn't planned to, but it came out the way things do when you finally started talking after holding them too long. I kept my voice neutral when I described the phone call. I didn't editorialize. I just told her what he said. She was quiet for a moment after that. "He said your mistakes aren't his responsibility," Claire repeated. Not a question, just making sure she had heard it correctly. "That's what he said." Another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was careful in a different way than Ethan's had been careful. His carefulness was the kind that protects. Hers was the kind that aims. Okay, Dad, I'm coming Saturday. Don't argue with me about it. Claire, you don't have to. Saturday, she said again, and something in her tone reminded me so much of her mother at 23, arguing with that ring toss operator, that I had to press my free hand against my eyes for a second. Okay, I said. Saturday. I didn't sleep much that night. Diana came to bed around 11, and we lay in the dark and didn't talk, which had become our most fluent language. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the word responsibility and how differently two people raised in the same house could come to understand it. Claire arrived at 10:30 Saturday morning in her 2014 Civic that had a dent in the rear quarter panel she'd been meaning to get fixed for 2 years. She came through the front door carrying a casserole dish covered in foil and a canvas grocery bag that clinked with jars of something. And she looked at me for about 3 seconds before she set everything down on the kitchen counter and crossed the room and hugged me. I am not, by nature, a man who accepts comfort easily. I have spent my whole adult life confusing stoicism with strength, which is a particular kind of foolishness that costs more than it saves. But I let her hug me. I stood in my own kitchen and let my daughter hold on, and I felt something in my chest. Not the bad thing, not the mass that Dr. Patel had circled on his notepad, but something older and more complicated, finally loosened just slightly. You look thinner, she said when she pulled back. I'm fine. You're not fine, Dad. That's why I'm here. She looked at me steadily. Where's Mom? Grocery store, she nodded. Something passed across her face that she didn't say out loud. She turned back to the counter and started unpacking the canvas bag. I made the chicken and rice thing, the one with the rosemary. You always liked that. You didn't have to cook. I know. She pulled out 2 mason jars of homemade soup. I wanted to. That's the thing about Claire that I have never been able to adequately explain to people who don't know her. She doesn't perform care. She doesn't arrive with a checklist or a strategy. She just walks into the room and starts doing the next necessary thing quietly, without making you feel like a burden for needing it. I have met adults 3 times her age who haven't figured out how to do that. We sat at the kitchen table while the casserole heated in the oven, and she asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning. Not the summary I'd given her on the phone, the real version. So I told her again in more detail this time, and she listened the way she'd always listened, with her chin resting on one hand and her eyes on my face, not on her phone, not on the window. When I got to the financial part, I pulled out the folder I'd put together. The hospital estimate, the insurance lapse paperwork, the rough calculation I'd done at 3 in the morning on a yellow legal pad, adding up what I had in savings, $11,200, and what I owed on the house and what was left after that, which was not enough. Not anywhere close to enough. Claire took the legal pad and studied it for a long time. Okay, she said finally. Claire, I have some savings. She said it like she was telling me the weather, just a fact, offered plainly. I know you do, and I'm not asking. Dad, she looked up at me. You called me because you needed help. I'm here, so let me help. That's how this works. Your savings are for your future. You've been putting that away for years. And my father needs surgery. She set the legal pad down. I think that qualifies as the future I was saving for. I looked at her across the table. She was 31 years old, and she had a dent in her car she couldn't afford to fix. And she was sitting in my kitchen talking about emptying her savings account like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe she understood something about the nature of family that I had failed to teach anyone, including myself. There's not enough, I said quietly. Even if you gave me everything you have, it's not enough. I know. She nodded slowly. I'm going to figure out the rest. I started to say something, but she held up one hand. Let me make some calls this week. I know a credit union that does personal loans. I have a friend who's a financial advisor who might know some options I don't know about yet. She paused. And I have a car. I stared at her. Claire, no. It's an old car. That's your car. You need that car. The bus goes to school. I've checked the route. It adds 45 minutes each way, but it's doable. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she'd already worked through the inconvenience and filed it away. 45 minutes each way, every day, in order to free up money to save my life. I couldn't speak for a moment. There was something happening in my throat that I was not going to let become crying, not because crying was weak, but because once I started, I wasn't sure I'd stop. "You cannot sell your car for me," I finally managed. "I'm not selling it for you," she said. "I'm selling it because you're my dad and you need surgery and this is what we do." She looked at me without flinching. "Unless you'd rather call Ethan back and ask him again." That landed. She knew it would. "That's not fair," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's not. None of this is fair." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine briefly. "But we're not talking about fair right now. We're talking about what's real." Diana came home 20 minutes later. She set her grocery bags on the counter and kissed Claire on the cheek, and said it was nice she'd come. And there was a version of warmth in it that was real. I want to be fair to Diana about that. She did love Claire, in the measured way she had learned to love things that didn't threaten her idea of how her life was supposed to go. Over dinner, Claire brought up the surgery again. She laid out what she'd told me. Her savings, the loan she was going to look into, the car. Diana listened. Her fork moved steadily between her plate and her mouth. "That's very generous of you," Diana said when Claire finished. "It's not generosity," Claire said. It's Dad." Diana looked at her for a moment. "You know Ethan has his own financial commitments right now. His investment portfolio is—" "I'm not talking about Ethan," Claire said. Her voice stayed even. "I'm talking about what needs to happen." Something tightened at the corners of Diana's mouth. "Of course. I just don't want you to overextend yourself, sweetheart. Your father wouldn't want that." "No," I said. "I wouldn't. But I also wouldn't want to die on a waiting list, so—" Nobody said anything after that for a few seconds. Diana refilled her water glass. Claire looked out the window. I stared at the chicken and rice. It was the most honest dinner we'd had in years. The following week moved in the jagged rhythm of medical bureaucracy. Forms, phone calls, scheduler hold music that I could now reproduce from memory. Dr. Patel referred me to a thoracic surgeon in Abilene, a Dr. Mon, who had done this particular procedure many times and spoke about it with the calm confidence of someone who had stopped being impressed by his own competence. That's what you want in a surgeon, I think. Someone who finds your crisis routine. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Dr. Mon wanted additional imaging and 2 pre-surgical consultations before then. The hospital's financial office helped me apply for a state assistance program that would cover a portion of the costs. The rest, still a number that made my hands shake a little when I looked at it on paper, would have to come from somewhere else. Claire sold her car on a Thursday. She texted me after. Got $4,200 for it, more than I expected. "Don't say anything, Dad." I didn't say anything. I sat with my phone in my lap and looked at that text for a long time. She came back to San Angelo 2 weeks before the surgery and stayed in her old bedroom, which Diana had converted into a sewing room but still had the twin bed in the corner. She had taken out a personal loan at an interest rate that made me wince when she showed me the paperwork, and she waved off my reaction. "It's manageable," she said. "The interest alone is—" "Dad, stop reading my loan documents and drink your soup." She cooked every night she was there, not elaborately. Claire has never been a showy cook. She's a practical one, the kind who makes things that are warm and filling and don't require a special trip to a specialty grocery store. Pasta. Soup. A brisket on the weekend that she started in the slow cooker Friday night, and that made the whole house smell different, warmer, like the house had remembered something it had forgotten about itself. I watched her moving around that kitchen the way I used to watch her play in the backyard when she was small, with this quiet wonder that something so good had come from my life. She was 31 years old, and she was riding the bus 45 minutes each way to a job she loved because she had sold her car to help pay for my surgery, and she moved through my house without resentment, without keeping score, without the faint ledger-keeping that I had spent years sensing in Diana's silences and Ethan's 2 brief phone calls. One evening, about a week before the surgery, I came into the kitchen and found her sitting at the table with a stack of papers. Looked like bills, her own bills, the ones she'd brought with her to work through on her laptop. She had a pencil behind her ear and a half-empty glass of iced tea, and she was frowning at something on the screen. She didn't hear me come in. I stood there for a moment, in the doorway of my own kitchen, watching my daughter manage a financial situation that I had helped create, not directly, not deliberately, but in the way that a father's failures have a way of narrowing his children's margins. And the feeling that moved through me was not something I have a clean word for. Gratitude doesn't cover it. Gratitude is what you feel when someone holds a door. This was heavier than that. This was the particular weight of understanding that someone loves you past the point where love is convenient, past the point where it makes any practical sense, past the point where any reasonable person would say enough and walk away. I cleared my throat and she looked up. "Working on something?" I asked, because I didn't know what else to say. "Just moving some things around?" She closed the laptop partway. "It's fine." "Claire." "Dad, I said it's fine." She picked up her iced tea. "Are you hungry?" "I was going to make something in about an hour." I crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. She looked at me with those steady gray eyes. "I need you to know something," I said. "You don't have to—" "Let me finish." I put my hands flat on the table. "I know I haven't always— I know the years were hard, when you were growing up, the money stuff, the stress. I know it affected you, and I never said enough about that. I'm saying it now." I paused. "And what you're doing for me, I don't have words for what this is." She was quiet for a moment. Her jaw did something small and tight that I recognized from when she was 9 years old and trying not to cry at something she thought she was too old to cry about. "You called me when things were bad," she said finally. "That's all I ever wanted. For you to call me." I didn't say anything. I nodded. "The rest is just details," she said, and she opened her laptop back up and went back to moving numbers around, which was the most Claire thing she could possibly have done. And I sat there a little longer than necessary before I got up to get a glass of water. The surgery was on a Tuesday. Claire drove me to Abilene in a rented car. She'd rented one for the week, something else she didn't mention until she was already pulling up to my house that morning, keys in hand. Diana came too. The three of us drove mostly in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but is just filled with things nobody knows how to say out loud. Dr. Mon was precise and unhurried. His pre-surgical briefing lasted 12 minutes. He shook my hand at the end of it, which I appreciated more than I expected to. Something about that handshake, the straightforwardness of it, made me feel less like a patient and more like a person. They took me back at 7:45. Claire stood up from the waiting room chair when they called my name, and she walked with me to the edge of where she was allowed to go, and she squeezed my hand once. "I'll be right here," she said. I nodded. I walked through the double doors. What I remember of the next 6 hours is mostly edges and gaps. The cold of the surgical suite, the anesthesiologist's voice counting down, and then nothing, and then a ceiling, and then Claire's face coming into focus above me, tired and relieved in equal measure, her hair escaping from its ponytail the way it always did by the end of a long day. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I said, though it came out rougher than I intended. "It went well. Dr. Mon said it went well." Her voice was steady, but I could see in the set of her shoulders that she had been holding a lot of weight for the past several hours and was only now beginning to let it down. "Good," I said. "Yeah." She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Good." Diana was there too, on the other side of the room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I said something and said she was glad it had gone well, and I believe she meant it. But it was Claire who stayed. It was Claire who sat in that chair beside my bed for the next 4 hours while I drifted in and out of the particular fog that follows anesthesia. And every time I surfaced and opened my eyes, she was there. That is a thing you do not forget. Not the surgery, not the diagnosis, not the phone call with Ethan, or the particular way Diana had looked at her fork during that dinner. You carry all of those things, yes, but what you carry deepest is the face that was there when you woke up. I recovered at Claire's apartment in Fort Worth because it made more logistical sense than staying in San Angelo. Closer to the surgical follow-up appointments, better transit access for her while she continued working, and in a way I didn't say out loud but think she understood, simply easier. Easier to be somewhere that felt like genuine home rather than a house where I had learned to interpret silence. Her apartment was small, a one-bedroom with a Murphy bed she unfolded in the living room for me. A kitchen barely big enough for two people to stand in, bookshelves crowded with paperbacks and lesson plan binders, and the kind of small decorative objects that a person accumulates not by design, but by living. Her students' artwork was taped to the refrigerator, crayon drawings of animals and houses, and the inexplicable abstract compositions that 8-year-olds produce with tremendous confidence. Every morning for the first 3 weeks, I heard her alarm go off at 5:45. I heard the shower, the coffee maker, the quiet sounds of a person getting themselves organized. And then I heard the front door, and then silence. And then I lay there in the Murphy bed in the half-dark and thought about the bus stop 2 blocks away, where my daughter walked every morning in whatever weather Texas was throwing that week. Because she had sold her car, because I had needed surgery, because life had arranged itself into this particular shape that I would not have chosen for either of us, and yet which was teaching me something I wasn't sure I could have learned any other way. I thought about Ethan in his uptown Dallas apartment, with his investment portfolio and his client dinners and his careful voice. I thought about the 70 acres outside of Odessa, just sitting there, contaminated, frozen, worth nothing to anyone, including me. And I thought, some things stay worthless forever. Some things just stay worthless until they don't. I didn't know yet why that thought surfaced on that particular morning. I would later, though. I would understand it completely, in a way that would change everything. For Claire, for me, and for the people who had decided years too early that we no longer had anything worth wanting. 6 weeks into my recovery, I could walk to the end of the block and back without needing to sit down afterward. That felt like progress. Dr. Maughan's follow-up appointments had gone well enough. Well enough being the particular brand of cautious optimism that surgeons deploy when they want to be encouraging without making promises they can't keep. The mass was gone. The margins were clean. We would monitor. We would watch. We would not use the word cured yet, but we would not use the other words either, the ones I had practiced hearing in my head during those first dark weeks before the surgery. Claire's apartment had become its own small universe. I knew the sounds of her building now. The upstairs neighbor who apparently rearranged furniture at 11 o'clock at night on a semi-regular basis. The couple on the ground floor whose dog barked exactly 3 times every morning at 6 and then went silent. I knew which burner on Claire's stove ran hot and which one lagged. I knew that she kept the good coffee in the freezer and the grocery store coffee in the cabinet, and that the difference between them was something she'd stopped apologizing for when she realized I didn't care. I was getting better, slowly, imperfectly, with bad days mixed into the good ones like stones in a field. But better. And then the letter came. It arrived on a Wednesday, sometime in the late morning, while Claire was at school. I heard the mail slot in the front door, and I got up from the couch, carefully, the way I still had to do most things, and walked to the entryway and picked up the small stack from the floor. 2 bills, a grocery circular, and a certified mail envelope with a return address from the Ector County Administrative Offices in Odessa. I stood there in the entryway of my daughter's apartment holding that envelope for longer than made sense. Certified mail from Ector County could mean a lot of things, and in my experience, most of them were bad. Another assessment notice, a lien update. Some new bureaucratic development on the property that had been quietly generating paperwork for a decade without generating anything else. I had a whole filing drawer back in San Angelo devoted to correspondence from that property, thick with government forms and legal notices and consultant reports. And almost none of it had ever contained good news. I took the envelope to the kitchen table and sat down. I made a cup of coffee first, the good kind, from the freezer. I don't know why exactly. Some instinct that said whatever was in that envelope deserved to be opened deliberately, not ripped into standing in a hallway. I sat down, set the coffee on the table, and opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages long, dense with the particular language that government documents use, full of reference numbers and statutory citations and phrases like pursuant to the findings of and as pertaining to the previously restricted parcel designated. I am not a fast reader of bureaucratic language anymore. I used to be, back when I was buying and selling property regularly and reading title documents was just part of the week. But it had been a long time, and my eyes moved slowly through the first page before the meaning started assembling itself. The environmental restriction on the Odessa property had been formally lifted. A comprehensive remediation assessment completed over the previous 18 months, conducted as part of a county-wide survey of legacy contamination sites, had determined that natural attenuation processes and the cessation of the original contaminating activity had rendered the parcel within acceptable thresholds. The legal freeze on development and sale had been removed as of 30 days prior. The property was, in the language of the document, available for unrestricted commercial use and transfer. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I turned to page 2, which contained a secondary notice, not from the county, but from a development company called Meridian Commercial Partners, LLC, which had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment. They had been tracking the county remediation process, the letter explained, because their parent company was actively expanding a commercial corridor that ran directly adjacent to the Odessa parcel. They were interested in acquiring the property. They had authorized their representative to make a formal offer. The number was on the 3rd page, $18,200,000. I put the letter down on the table. I picked up my coffee. I put it down again without drinking it. Outside Claire's kitchen window, the Fort Worth morning was doing what Fort Worth mornings do in late spring, bright and warming fast, the kind of day that makes you squint when you first step outside. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower was running. The upstairs neighbor was apparently moving furniture again, which was early for him. $18 million. For 70 acres of West Texas scrubland that had cost me everything I had and spent a decade sitting there accumulating nothing but county tax bills and my own shame. I sat at that kitchen table and I did not feel joy, not immediately. What I felt first was something stranger than joy, a kind of vertigo, the sensation of the floor reorganizing itself beneath you. I had spent so many years understanding that property as the symbol of my failure, the physical embodiment of every bad decision and piece of bad luck that had unraveled my life, that my brain needed a moment to process the possibility that the story might not be finished yet. Then I thought about Claire at a bus stop in the rain, which it had been 2 weeks ago, a cold front that had come through unexpected. She'd come home with wet shoes and hadn't mentioned it, and something settled in me, quiet and absolute. I picked up my phone and I did not call Diana. I did not call Ethan. I sat with the number in my hand for a long moment, and then I called a man named Gerald Foss, who had been my attorney for 22 years, and who I had not spoken to in 14 months because there had been nothing worth calling an attorney about. Gerald picked up on the second ring. "Walter Bennett," he said, with the tone of a man who is genuinely surprised and somewhat pleased. "I was wondering if you dropped off the earth." "Not quite," I said. "Gerald, I need to talk to you about the Odessa property." A brief pause. "Okay." "Something's happened." I looked at the letter on the table. "Can we meet this week? In person?" "I can do Thursday," he said. "You want to tell me what we're dealing with?" "Not on the phone," I said. "Thursday." I didn't tell Claire about the letter that night. I sat with it through dinner. She made pasta, something quick because she had papers to grade, and we ate at the small table by the window, while she told me about a student named Marcus who had apparently decided that math was a conspiracy against him personally and was making this known to anyone who would listen. I laughed at the right places. I asked follow-up questions. I was present enough that she didn't notice I was also somewhere else entirely. I needed to understand what I was holding before I said a word about it to anyone. Gerald's office was on the 4th floor of a downtown building that smelled the same as it had in 2003 when I first walked in to close my first real property deal. Old carpet and copy paper, and the particular institutional smell of a place where serious conversations happen every day until they become routine. Gerald himself was 71, compact and unhurried, with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck that he had been teased about for at least 15 years and refused to change. He read the county letter first, then the Meridian letter. He read them the way lawyers read things, slowly and without visible reaction, going back to check something on page 1 after reading something on page 3. When he finished, he set both documents down on his desk and looked at me over his glasses. "Well," he said. "Yeah," I said, "this is real." He tapped the Meridian letter. "I know this firm. They're legitimate. If they're making this number in writing, they've done their homework and they mean it." He leaned back in his chair. "Walter, do you understand what this is?" "I think so," I said. "I'm sitting here trying to." This is $18 million. He said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that requires no decoration. For a property you paid $340 for and have been carrying for 11 years. Yes. And Diana is no longer on the title. He said it carefully, watching my face. That's what I need to talk to you about, I said. Walk me through what happened there, exactly. Gerald opened his filing cabinet. He still used physical files, which I had always found both maddening and reassuring, and pulled out a folder that was thicker than I expected. He spread several documents on the desk and walked me through the timeline. 8 years ago, when the property had been frozen for 3 years and showed no signs of resolving, Diana had come to Gerald separately, without telling me, which I had not known until this moment, and which landed somewhere in my chest like a small cold stone, and asked about legally separating her financial interests from the Odessa parcel. She had cited the ongoing liability, the uncertainty, the risk to her personal credit. Gerald had explained her options. She had chosen the cleanest one, a formal legal separation of interest, signed and filed, removing her name from any future claims to the property or its proceeds. Ethan had been involved in that conversation. Gerald confirmed it carefully, watching me as he did. Ethan had apparently encouraged it, had spoken with Diana about the logic of cutting the loss cleanly, of not letting Walter's bad investment drag down what remained of the family's financial position. They had done it legally, they had done it properly, and they had not told me. I sat with that for a moment. Did you know about this at the time? I asked Gerald. Diana came to me as a client, he said. She was entitled to that. Well, that's not what I asked. He met my eyes. I knew, he said, and I want you to understand that I advised her to tell you. She chose not to. I nodded. I looked at the document on his desk. Diana's signature dated 8 years ago, on a form that had quietly and completely removed her from any claim to what was now $18 million. And Ethan? I asked. Ethan is not on the title. He never was. Gerald folded his hands. Walter, the property is yours. Entirely yours. There are no co-owners, no co-claimants. Whatever you do with the proceeds is completely at your discretion. I looked at the window behind Gerald's desk. Downtown Abilene was going about its Thursday in the sun below. Ordinary Thursday. People with ordinary problems. I want to put it in a trust, I said. Gerald waited. A protected trust. For Claire. I turned back to him. I want to understand exactly how to do that so that it cannot be contested, cannot be challenged, cannot be touched by anyone else. I want it done right, and I want it done before I tell another living soul about this money. Gerald studied me for a moment. You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 4 days. Diana will find out eventually. Yes, I said. She will. Ethan, too. Yes. And you understand what that conversation is going to look like. I thought about a phone call on a Thursday evening, a restaurant in the background, low music, glasses. Your mistakes are not my responsibility anymore. I thought about a bus stop in the rain, wet shoes that went unmentioned. I understand exactly what it's going to look like, I said. That's why I need the trust completed first. Gerald held my gaze for another moment. Then he nodded, slowly, and reached for his legal pad. All right, he said. Let's talk about how to do this. 1. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life, and I have had some genuinely strange weeks. I was walking around Claire's apartment, eating her cooking, watching her grade papers at the kitchen table, carrying a secret that felt physical, like something I was holding in my hands that I couldn't set down. Every time she looked at me, I was aware of it. Every time she mentioned money. The loan payment she'd made that week, a bill she was reorganizing, the small, careful math of a person living closer to the edge than she should have been. I felt the weight of it press against the inside of my ribs. I went back to San Angelo once, briefly, to retrieve some documents Gerald needed from my files. Diana was home. She was polite. She asked about my recovery. She made me lunch. We sat in the kitchen of the house I'd nearly lost twice and ate sandwiches and talked about nothing in particular. And she did not mention the document she had signed 8 years ago, and I did not mention that I now knew about it. That was the longest lunch of my life. Ethan called while I was there. Diana answered, and I sat at the table and listened to her side of the conversation, which told me everything and nothing. He was well. Work was busy. He might come down for a visit in the fall. When she hung up and turned back to me, she said, "He asks about you, you know. He does care." I ate my sandwich. "Okay," I said. "Walter." She sat down. She had that expression she sometimes got, the one where she was working up to something she'd decided to say before she lost the nerve to say it. "I know things have been hard between you and Ethan, but he's built a real life. You have to respect that." "I do," I said. And I did. I respected what Ethan had built. I just also remembered who he'd been when I needed him most. "I think it would mean a lot if you reached out to him," Diana said. "Made some kind of peace. He's your son." I looked at her across the table, my wife of 33 years, the woman in the yellow dress, the woman who had signed a document 8 years ago and not told me, who had been quietly protecting her interests while I was drowning in mine, who had responded to my fear and my illness with the detached concern of someone who has already made a different plan. "I know he is," I said. I drove back to Fort Worth that afternoon. Gerald called me the following Tuesday. The trust documents were ready. He walked me through each page over the phone, slowly and carefully, the way he did everything. The structure was clean and tight. Claire was the sole beneficiary. The trust was protected from third-party claims. Once I signed, the Meridian sale could proceed and the funds would transfer directly into the trust. "Are you sure about this?" Gerald asked. Not challenging it, just asking, doing his job. "Gerald," I said, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." "Okay then." A pause. "For what it's worth, Walter, I think this is right." "I think so too," I said. I signed the documents on a Thursday. Gerald notarized them. The Meridian sale was formally initiated. It would take approximately 3 to 4 weeks to clear. I went back to Claire's apartment that evening, and she had made soup, the kind from the mason jars she'd brought to my house in San Angelo the very first time she came. The rosemary chicken, heating on the stove and filling the whole apartment with something warm. She was at the table grading papers, pencil behind her ear, red pen in hand, her reading glasses pushed up on her head the way she'd started doing last year. She looked up when I came in. "You okay?" she asked. "You seem different." "I'm fine," I said. She studied me for a second, the way she always had, those gray eyes catching things other people missed. "Good different or bad different?" I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. "Good," I said. "I think good." She held my gaze for another moment, then went back to her papers. "Soup's almost ready," she said. "Smells great," I said. I sat down across from her and watched her mark something carefully in the margin of a student's worksheet, and I thought about what Gerald had said on the phone. "For what it's worth, Walter, I think this is right." And I thought about my father, pressing his thumb into the soil. Land remembers you even after you forget yourself. That land had remembered me. And in a few weeks, everything it had held on to through 11 years of freezes and failures and quiet shame was going to belong to the one person in my life who had never once made me feel like I needed to earn her presence. I didn't know yet how Diana and Ethan would find out. I didn't know what shape that confrontation would take or how ugly it might get before it was over. What I knew, sitting in that small kitchen, listening to soup simmer and a pencil scratch across paper, was that for the first time in 11 years, I had done something right with that land, and nothing that came next was going to change that. The sale cleared on a Friday. Gerald called me at 9:43 in the morning, and I know the exact time, because I had been watching the clock on Claire's microwave for the better part of an hour, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I waited. When my phone buzzed and his name came up on the screen, I picked it up before the second ring finished. "It's done," Gerald said. "The funds transferred this morning. The trust is funded and sealed. $18,200,000 minus closing costs and my fees, which I've itemized in the paperwork I'm sending you this afternoon." A pause. "Walter, it's done." I sat there with the phone against my ear. "Okay," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "You doing all right?" "Yeah." I looked at the window. The Fort Worth morning outside was overcast, one of those low gray skies that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain. "Yeah, Gerald, I'm all right." "Take the weekend," he said. "There's nothing that needs to happen today. The paperwork will keep. Just sit with it. After I hung up, I did exactly that. I sat with it. I sat with it for a long time at that small kitchen table in my daughter's apartment, in the quiet of a Friday morning with the refrigerator humming and someone's car alarm going off briefly down the street and then stopping. I thought about the 70 acres outside of Odessa. I thought about the day I first walked that land, the way the West Texas sky had been so wide and blue it almost hurt to look at. I thought about the day the environmental notice came, and the particular quality of the silence that had followed me home from that county office, and the years of nights I had lain awake turning the mistake over in my head like a stone you keep picking up, even though it cuts your hand every time. And now it was over. The land was gone, and the money was somewhere safe, and the person it was meant for was 45 minutes away in a classroom, kneeling beside a desk to help a boy named Marcus make peace with multiplication. She didn't know yet. I had decided to wait until the weekend to tell her. I wanted to do it right, not over the phone, not in a rushed moment between her coming home and making dinner. I wanted to sit across from her at this same kitchen table and watch her face when I told her, so that I could carry that particular image for whatever years I had left. I made it until Saturday morning. She came out of her bedroom at 7:30 in the sweatshirt she'd had since college, hair pulled back, already reaching for the coffee before she was fully awake. I was already at the table. I had made the good coffee, the kind from the freezer, and there were 2 cups, and I had put out the creamer she used, which I had stopped needing to be told about. She poured her coffee and looked at me. Registered something. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around her mug. "How are you feeling? Physically, I mean." "Better," I said. "Claire, I need to tell you something." She went still. The particular stillness of a person who has learned that sentences starting with "I need to tell you something" can go a lot of different directions, and not all of them good. "Okay," she said carefully. I told her. I started with the letter from Ector County, and I walked her through all of it. The Meridian offer, the call to Gerald, the trust. I watched her face while I talked. She didn't interrupt. She held her coffee mug with both hands, and she listened with those serious gray eyes, and the muscle in her jaw did the small, tight thing it did when she was managing her reaction. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. $18 million, she said finally. Not to me. More like she was hearing the number out loud for the first time and seeing if it changed shape when spoken. 18.2, I said. After costs, a little under 17. She put her coffee mug down. "Dad." "It's yours," I said. "It's already in the trust. Gerald has all the documentation. I wanted you to hear it from me, face to face, before anything else happened." She pressed both hands flat on the table. I could see she was working through something. "Why me?" she asked. "I mean, I know why, but I want to hear you say it." I looked at her. This woman who had taken the bus to work in wet shoes without mentioning it, who had made me soup in mason jars and driven me to surgical consultations in a rented car and sat beside my hospital bed for 4 hours while I came back from anesthesia. "Because when I had nothing," I said, "you showed up. That's it. That's the whole reason." She looked at me for another moment, and then she pressed her fingers over her eyes, and she made a sound that was not quite crying but was close to it. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding something tightly for a very long time, and someone finally says it's okay to let go. "I didn't do it for this," she said. Her voice was unsteady. "I know that," I said. "That's exactly why." We sat there together for a while. Outside, the clouds from the day before had cleared and the morning was bright, coming through the kitchen window at that low Saturday angle that makes ordinary rooms look better than they are. She cried a little, quietly, which she would have been embarrassed about if I'd pointed it out. I didn't point it out. I just sat with her the way she had sat with me, and let the morning be what it was. The call from Diana came on Monday. I should say I had known it was coming. I simply hadn't known the exact shape it would take. Gerald had warned me, property sale records in Texas are public, and anyone motivated enough to look would find the Meridian transaction within days of it being filed. Diana had people she talked to. Ethan had resources and the particular hunger of a man who tracked numbers the way other people track weather. It was Diana who called first, which surprised me slightly. I had expected Ethan. Walter. Her voice was controlled, tight, but controlled. I need you to tell me what's happened with the Odessa property. Hello, Diana, I said. Don't do that. Don't be pleasant. I've just spent the last hour on the phone with my cousin who works at the county recorder's office, and she's telling me there was a sale registered last week for a parcel in Ector County that matches the legal description of your land. A pause. Your land that was worth nothing, that was contaminated, that we all wrote off. It was remediated, I said. The county cleared it about 2 months ago. Silence. How much? She asked. I told her. The silence that followed was different from the first one, denser. $18 million, Diana said, each word placed separately, like she was setting them down on a table to examine them. Approximately, after costs. And you didn't tell me. Her voice shifted. The control was still there, but something underneath it was moving. Walter, I am your wife. I have been your wife for 33 years. You sold a piece of property for $18 million, and you did not tell me. You separated your interest from that property 8 years ago, I said. My voice was steady. I had prepared for this. Not rehearsed exactly, but I had sat with what I needed to say and let it settle into something I could stand behind. You did it legally and properly and without telling me. Gerald showed me the documents. Another silence. This one had a different quality again. The quality of a person recalculating. That was a protective measure, Diana said carefully. Anyone in my position would have done the same thing. The property was a liability. Yes, I said. It was. And you protected yourself from it, and then it stopped being a liability. Walter, Diana. I said her name quietly, the way I had said Ethan's name on that phone call months ago, and the effect was similar. It stopped her. We can talk about a lot of things. We probably need to. But I want you to understand that the trust is already established. The funds are already transferred. There's nothing to reverse. I heard her breathing. Who did you put it in trust for? She said. It wasn't really a question. Claire. The sound she made was short and hard. Not quite a laugh. Claire. She said it like she was tasting something. Of course. She sold her car for my surgery, I said. She took a high-interest personal loan. She rode the bus 45 minutes each way every day so she could free up money to keep me alive. While you told me to call Ethan, while Ethan told me my mistakes weren't his responsibility anymore. I paused. I made a decision about my own property. I have that right. You have that right, Diana repeated. Her voice had gone cold in a way I recognized. The cold she used when she was furious and choosing precision over volume. You have that right. 33 years, Walter. 33 years of my life. I know how long it's been, and this is what I get. Diana. I stopped. There was a lot I could have said at that moment. About the document she had signed, about the choice she had made 8 years ago to quietly step away from the risk without telling me, about the years of managed distance and polite dinners, and the particular way she had held her fork that evening at Claire's table when Claire said, "It's just Dad." I could have said all of it. We need to talk, I said instead. In person, when you're ready, but the trust stands. She hung up. Ethan called 40 minutes later. I was still sitting in the same chair. He did not begin with pleasantries. Dad, what the hell is going on? Hello, Ethan. Mom just called me. She said you sold the Odessa property. She said $18 million. She said you put everything in a trust for Claire. His voice had the clipped, rapid quality it got when he was angry and trying to sound like he wasn't. Is that true? Yes, I said. All of it. You put all of it in a trust for Claire. Yes. Dad. He made a sound that was half exhale, half something else. That is family money. That property was a family asset for over a decade. You can't just... Ethan, I said. Listen to me carefully, because I'm going to say this once. The property was in my name only. Your mother removed herself from it 8 years ago. You were never on it. Legally, it belongs to me and always has. I chose to put the proceeds in a trust for your sister. I had every right to do that. You're seriously going to stand on technicalities right now? We're talking about $18 million, I said. Yes, and I'm going to tell you how I decided what to do with it. I paused. When I called you in February and told you I had a mass in my lung and I needed surgery and I didn't have the money to pay for it, what did you say to me? Silence. I remember exactly what you said, I continued. You said my mistakes were not your responsibility anymore. You said you'd spent too much of your life dealing with the consequences of my choices. And then you hung up. I let that sit for a moment. Your sister emptied her savings account. She took out a loan she's still paying interest on. She sold her car and rode the bus to work every day for 3 months. She sat next to my hospital bed for 4 hours while I was in surgery. Another pause. So yes, the money is going to Claire, and no, I don't think that's unfair. Ethan was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, the clipped anger had changed into something harder to read. I have a family to think about, he said. I have financial commitments. I couldn't just... You have $10 million, I said. I know because you mentioned it to me. You mentioned it the way you mention most things, to make sure I knew the number. I kept my voice even. You didn't help me because you chose not to. That was your right, and this is mine. This isn't over, he said. I'm going to talk to a lawyer. Talk to as many lawyers as you want, I said. Gerald has been my attorney for 22 years, and the trust is structured correctly. But more importantly, I stopped for a second, steadying myself. More importantly, Ethan, I hope someday you think about what you actually lost here, and it's not the money. He hung up, just like his mother. I put the phone face down on the table and sat in the quiet of Claire's apartment for a long time after that. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, kids were playing in the street, their voices carrying through the window in that shapeless, cheerful way that children's voices do. They came on a Wednesday, both of them, together, which told me that Ethan had driven from Dallas and that they had coordinated, and that they had decided there was strength in numbers. Claire opened the door when they knocked because she was home. It was an in-service day at her school, no students, and she'd been at the kitchen table with a stack of curriculum binders when the knock came. I heard her open the door and then a beat of silence that told me everything before any word was spoken. I came out of the living room and found the four of us arranged in the small entryway of Claire's apartment like a scene someone had badly staged. Diana in a blouse I recognized, pressed and deliberate. Ethan in a jacket, jaw set, looking like he hadn't slept well. Claire standing with her hand still on the doorknob, reading the room. Come in, I said. Diana and Ethan came in. Nobody sat down right away. The apartment felt smaller than it was. I think we should talk about this rationally, Diana said. She addressed it to me, but she was looking at the room in the careful way she looked at things she was assessing. All four of us, like adults. I agree, I said. I sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, the others followed. Claire across from me, Diana and Ethan side by side, which again told me something about how they had come in. Your father is making a decision that affects this entire family, Diana said to Claire, with a tone that was meant to be reasonable and landed somewhere just short of it. I think it's important that you understand that. I understand it, Claire said. Her voice was level. She had a quality under pressure that I had always admired. Not coldness, but a kind of settled clarity. She didn't escalate and she didn't shrink. She just stayed exactly where she was. Dad told me what he's decided. I understand it completely. Claire. Ethan leaned forward. He had the salesman's posture, elbows on the table, hands open. I had watched him develop that in his 20s, the physicality of persuasion. I know this feels like it's between you and Dad, but there's a bigger picture here. Mom has 33 years invested in this family. We all have, a claim on what? Claire asked. Her voice stayed even. On Dad's property? On family assets, yes. It wasn't a family asset, Claire said. It was Dad's property. It's been in his name the whole time, you know that. Ethan's jaw tightened. Mom was legally married to him when Mom signed a document 8 years ago removing herself, Claire said. She looked at Diana. I've seen it. Dad showed it to me. Something shifted in Diana's expression, a small recalibration. That was a protective measure, Diana said, under duress. I felt pressured at the time by the situation, and Diana. I said her name quietly, and she stopped. I reached down to the chair beside me, where I had placed a folder that morning. Gerald had sent me a full copy of all the relevant documents, and I had organized them the way I used to organize paperwork when I was still in the real estate business, by date, by relevance, by what a person needed to see first. I opened the folder and placed the separation agreement on the table. You came to Gerald's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I've seen his notes. He advised you to tell me. You declined. You signed and you left, and you went home and made dinner, and you didn't say a word. I slid the document across the table so she could see her own signature. That's what happened. Diana looked at the document. She didn't touch it. That doesn't mean, she started. It means exactly what it says. My voice was still even. I had been angry in the weeks since Gerald had told me. I had moved through the anger slowly, the way you move through deep water, and I had come out the other side into something that was not quite calm, but was at least clear. You made a decision to protect yourself. That's fine. I'm not saying it was wrong. I'm saying it had consequences you didn't anticipate. I paused. That's something I understand better than most people. Ethan looked at his mother, then back at me. The salesman posture had shifted slightly. Less open, more careful. So that's it, he said. You've decided. There's nothing to discuss. There's plenty to discuss, I said. We're a family and we have things we need to work through, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But the trust? No. That's not up for discussion. That's done. You're doing this out of spite, Ethan said. The careful had cracked a little. You're punishing us because I'm doing this because your sister saved my life, I said. And you said my mistakes were not your responsibility. I didn't say that to wound you, Ethan. I'm saying it because it's the truth, and we should be able to say true things to each other. I looked at him across the table. My son, who had his mother's sharpness and his grandfather's jaw, and the particular hunger of a man who had decided his father's failures were a cautionary tale rather than a human story. You made a choice. She made a different one. And I made mine. The room was quiet for a moment. Claire hadn't said anything in a while. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, watching. When she spoke, it was quietly, and she directed it at her brother. Ethan, she said, I didn't do what I did to get anything from it. I want you to know that. I sold my car and took out the loan because he's our dad and he was sick, and that's what you do. She paused. I would have done the same for you. Something moved across Ethan's face. It was there, and then it was managed away, but I saw it. Something that might have been shame, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once, which is often how those two things arrive. He didn't say anything. Diana gathered herself. She straightened in the chair the way she did when she was concluding something. I think we're going to need some time, she said, to process this, to look at our options. Of course, I said. I want to be clear that I don't accept this as final. You can feel however you need to feel about it, I said. The trust is final. What you do with your feelings about it, that's yours. She stood. Ethan stood. Claire walked them to the door and I stayed at the table. I heard the door open and Diana say something brief that I couldn't make out, and then the door closed and Claire came back and stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked at me. You okay? She asked. I thought about it honestly. My chest was tight. My hands were not entirely steady. I had just sat at a table with my wife of 33 years and my son and said things that could not be unsaid, and I did not know yet what shape any of this would take going forward, or how many phone calls from lawyers were coming, or what the next year of my life was actually going to look like. No, I said, not completely. She nodded. That was the right answer, and we both knew it. She went to the stove and turned on the burner under the kettle, because that's what Claire does. She finds the next practical thing, and she does it. Tea? She said. Yeah, I said. Tea would be good. I sat at that table and listened to the water heat and thought about how a man spends years believing the worst thing that ever happened to him was a piece of bad land. And then one day he finds out the land was never the point. The land was just the test. And what matters, the only thing that ever really mattered, was who stayed with you while you waited to find out if you'd passed. The tea helped, not in any dramatic way. It didn't fix anything or soften the jagged edges of what had just happened in that kitchen. But it was warm, and it was real, and Claire sat across from me while we drank it, and we didn't talk for a while, which was its own kind of comfort. That evening, after Claire had gone to bed, I sat on her small balcony in the dark. It was barely big enough for 2 chairs and a planter she'd been meaning to replant for a year. The dead stalks of something she'd tried to grow still standing in the dirt, like little monuments to a good intention that ran out of time. The Fort Worth night was warm and still. I could hear the highway in the distance, that constant low hum that city nights carry, and I sat there and let the events of the day settle through me the way sediment settles through water, slowly, with some things sinking and some things rising. I thought about Diana's face when I slid that document across the table, the way she had looked at her own signature without touching the paper, like it was something she didn't want to be associated with even now. I had spent the week since Gerald showed me that document trying to understand how I felt about what she had done, and I had moved through a lot of different feelings in a lot of different orders before I arrived somewhere that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite indifference, but was somewhere in between. An acceptance that people protect themselves, that fear makes people do quiet things they don't announce, and that Diana's fear had never been a secret even when her actions were. She had been afraid of going under with me. I understood that fear. I had lived inside it for 11 years. That didn't make the secrecy right, but I had spent too many years being the kind of man who turned pain into silence, and I didn't have the energy left to hold that against her the way anger wants you to hold things. Ethan was harder. I sat with Ethan for a long time out there in the dark. My son. The boy who had been 16 and already certain I was wrong about the land, who had grown into a man by making my failures the foundation of his own ambition, who had looked at my crisis and calculated rather than responded, and then packaged that calculation as a kind of earned wisdom. Your mistakes are not my responsibility anymore. He believed that. I could hear it in how quickly he said it, not worked up to, not reluctant, just stated. A policy he had decided on and was applying cleanly. I thought about the thing I'd seen cross his face when Claire said she would have done the same for him. That flash of something, shame, grief, the recognition of a road not taken, that he had managed away before it could reach his expression. I thought about what it would cost a man like Ethan to feel that thing fully, without managing it, whether he ever would. I didn't know. That was honest. I didn't know what Ethan was going to do with any of this, or what shape he and I would take going forward, or whether the conversation we needed to have, not about the money, but about everything underneath the money, would ever actually happen. Some things don't get resolved. Some relationships find their level and hold there, below what you hoped for, and you learn to stop measuring the distance. But I was 60 years old and I had just come through surgery, and $18 million had fallen out of 11 years of shame like a coin from a coat pocket. And I had made a decision I believed in completely. And for the first time in longer than I could cleanly remember, I was not apologizing for who I was. That felt like something worth sitting with in the dark. Gerald called the following Monday with news I had not anticipated. Ethan had retained an attorney. The attorney had filed a preliminary inquiry with the county regarding the trust structure, looking for procedural grounds to challenge it. Gerald's voice on the phone was calm. The calm of a man who has been doing this for 40 years and knows the difference between a real threat and a display of one. They're not going to find anything, he said. The trust is clean. The property was solely in your name. The separation agreement is airtight, and you were entirely within your rights. Any challenge is going to cost him more in legal fees than he could possibly recover, and any competent attorney is going to tell him that within the first consultation. So this is noise, I said. This is noise, Gerald confirmed. Expensive, unpleasant noise. But noise. I sat with that for a moment. Do I need to do anything? No, I'll handle any correspondence. You just live your life, Walter. Live your life. Simple enough instruction. Harder than it sounds when your son has retained a lawyer and your wife of 33 years hasn't returned your last 2 calls, and you're still sleeping on a Murphy bed in your daughter's living room recovering from lung surgery. But I was trying. I told Claire about the legal inquiry that evening. I didn't want her to hear it from somewhere else, and I didn't want to carry it around like a secret. I had carried enough of those. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. "Is it going to work?" she asked. "His challenge." "Gerald says no." "Okay." She nodded slowly. "Okay. Then, are you angry?" I thought about it honestly. "A little," I said. "Not as much as I expected to be." "Why not?" "Because I think he's scared," I said. "I think Ethan has spent his whole adult life being scared of ending up like me. And when something happens that he can't control, that plays out in a way his money and his planning didn't account for, the only thing he knows how to do is fight it." I paused. "That's sad more than it makes me angry." Claire looked at me for a moment. "When did you get wise?" she said. "I've always been wise," I said. "I was just too busy being stupid to use it." She smiled at that. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her in a few days, and it did what her smiles always did. It made the room feel slightly more inhabitable. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I mean, going forward, with all of it, with Mom, with Ethan, with—" She gestured at the general shape of everything, which I understood to mean the money and the family and the next chapter of a life that had just reorganized itself completely. "I don't know all of it yet," I said, "but I know some of it." "Tell me the sum." I looked at my hands on the table. My father's hands, I had always thought. The same knuckles, the same particular way the tendons stood up when I spread my fingers flat. Hands that had held a lot of paperwork over the years. Hands that had signed a lot of things that didn't work out. "I'm going to move out of San Angelo," I said. "The house. Diana and I need to talk about the house, and about everything that comes with 33 years of a marriage reaching its end, and that's going to be its own long thing." I paused. "But I'm not going back to that house to live. I've been in that house for 15 years, and I've spent most of them feeling like a disappointment that got left somewhere and forgotten. I'm not doing that anymore." Claire nodded. She didn't say anything. "And I want to be close to you," I said. "If that's okay. Not in your apartment. I'm aware that the Murphy bed has a limited lifespan, and I am not going to be the thing that ends it. But near. In Fort Worth, maybe. Somewhere I can actually build something instead of just maintain something." "That's more than okay," she said. Her voice had gone slightly unsteady in the way it did when she was feeling more than she was showing. Yes, Dad, that's more than okay." "Good," I said. "Then that's the plan." What happened over the following months did not happen cleanly. I want to be honest about that, because the temptation in any story like this one is to let the resolution arrive neatly, to let the pieces fall into their proper places with a satisfying click, and that is not what life actually does. Life is messier than that. Life makes you work for the clarity even after you've already paid what felt like the full price. Diana and I had 4 conversations over the course of 2 months that were the hardest conversations of my life, and I include in that the conversation with Dr. Patel in his office, the conversation with Ethan on the Thursday phone call, and the conversation with Gerald when I signed the trust documents. 33 years of a marriage doesn't end in one meeting around a kitchen table. It ends in stages, through phone calls and silences, and the slow sorting of shared objects and shared memories into separate categories. Diana was angry for a long time. I understood that. She had made a calculation 8 years ago that seemed reasonable at the time: step away from the sinking ship, protect what's left. And then the ship had turned out not to be sinking after all, and the life raft she'd climbed onto had not gotten her where she expected. That's its own kind of grief, the grief of a decision that felt smart until it didn't. I didn't rub it in. I didn't reference the document again after that day at the kitchen table. What was done, and pointing at it repeatedly would only make both of us smaller. What I did say to her, in the third of those 4 conversations, sitting across from each other in the office of a mediator in Abilene, who had the careful neutrality of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by nothing. Diana, I want you to know that I don't think you're a bad person. I think we were two people who ran out of the right way to take care of each other a long time ago, and we kept going because stopping felt impossible. And I'm sorry for my part in that. There's more of my part than I probably ever said out loud. She looked at me across the mediator's table. Something in her face shifted. You could have told me about the land, she said, when the letter came. You could have called me. I know, I said. I made a choice. It wasn't fair. No, I said. It wasn't. I held her gaze. Neither was the document you signed without telling me. We both made choices that weren't fair, and here we are. She looked away. Out of the window, Abilene was going about its Tuesday. She was quiet for a long moment. I hope you're well, Walter, she said finally. I mean that. I hope the health stuff stays manageable, and I hope whatever comes next is better for you. She paused. You deserve better than you got. From life. From me, probably. I'm not good at saying things like that. You said it, I said. That counts. We finalized the divorce 6 months after that conversation. She kept the San Angelo house, which was fair. I wasn't going back to it, and she had been the one maintaining it for years. There was other division, other negotiation, other paperwork that I signed at Gerald's desk over 2 separate visits. None of it was easy, and none of it was clean, and there were moments when the 33 years pressed against the present like weather and made everything harder to see. But it was done. And when it was done, I felt not free exactly. Freedom is too light a word for what follows the end of something that long, but unburdened. Like a coat I'd been wearing for years that I hadn't noticed the weight of until I finally took it off. Ethan's legal challenge went nowhere, exactly as Gerald had predicted. His attorney, to his credit, apparently told him within 2 weeks that the case had no viable path and that pursuing it further would be expensive and futile. The inquiry was withdrawn quietly, without fanfare, without any communication directly to me. I heard about it through Gerald. Ethan and I did not speak for 4 months after the Wednesday in Claire's apartment. I did not call him, and he did not call me, and I held that distance without filling it with invented meanings. Maybe he needed time. Maybe he was too proud. Maybe he was still in the middle of whatever it was that flash across his face had shown me, that recognition of the road not taken. And working through it took longer than 4 months. He called me on a Sunday afternoon in November. I was in my new apartment in Fort Worth, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building 10 minutes from Claire's, with a small balcony that actually had enough room for a real chair and a table and a decent view of a park across the street. I had been drinking coffee and reading, which had become my Sunday routine and which I protected like it was a practice rather than a pastime. When his name came up on my phone, I sat with it for 1 ring before I answered. Ethan, I said. Dad. His voice was different from the last time. The clipped precision was gone. He sounded tired, and tired is sometimes the most honest a person can be. I'm not calling to argue about anything. I just wanted to... He stopped, started again. How are you feeling, health-wise? Better, I said. 6-month scan came back clean. Dr. Mon seems cautiously optimistic. Good, he said. That's good. I'm glad. Silence. Not hostile. Just the silence of 2 people who have said hard things to each other and are now standing on the other side of those things trying to find the right footing. I've been thinking, Ethan said finally, about what you said. At Claire's. About me being scared. He paused. I don't know if that's exactly right, but I've been thinking about it. Okay, I said. I want you to know I'm not proud of the phone call, he said. In February, what I said. Another pause, and I could hear how much it cost him to say it. Ethan had built his identity around never owing an apology, and unpacking that cost real effort. I was wrong. You were sick, and you called me, and I said something I shouldn't have said. I'm not trying to make excuses for it. I sat with that. Outside my balcony window, the park was doing its November thing. Nearly bare trees, a couple walking a dog on the path, a kid on a bicycle taking a corner too fast, and recovering with that particular reckless grace that only children have. I hear you, I said. That's it? His voice had a slightly uncertain quality. You're not going to... Ethan. I said it gently. You apologized. I heard it. I'm not going to make you pay for it again after you've already paid the price that things cost. That's not how I want to do this anymore. I paused. I'd like us to find a way forward. I'm not saying everything gets fixed in a phone call, but I'd like to try. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. Me too. We talked for 40 minutes. It was not the conversation that fixed everything. That conversation doesn't exist, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something. But it was real. We talked about his work, his life in Dallas, something he said briefly and carefully about a woman he'd been seeing who he thought might be serious. I told him about the new apartment and the clean scan and the Sunday coffee reading routine. We talked around the big things, and then we talked about a few of them directly, haltingly, imperfectly, the way people do when they are genuinely trying. When we hung up, I sat on the balcony for a while. I didn't know what Ethan and I were going to become. Maybe we became people who talked occasionally and rebuilt something partial and functional. Maybe something warmer, given enough time and enough honesty. Maybe the damage was structural in ways that couldn't be fully repaired. I didn't know. But we were trying, and trying is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only place anything real ever starts. Claire paid off her loan in full in January. She called me when she made the final payment from the parking lot of her bank, and she said, "Dad, it's done," with a kind of exhale in her voice, like she'd been holding her breath since the day she signed the paperwork. I told her that was the best news I'd heard since the 6-month scan came back clean, and I meant both things equally. She bought a house in April. Not extravagant. I want to be clear about that, because Claire's relationship with money had been shaped by years of having very little of it, and that shapes a person in ways that don't simply evaporate because the number in their account changes. She bought a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood with good schools and old trees and a backyard that needed work because she was a teacher and she believed in good schools and old trees and projects that required sustained effort. She called me from the driveway on the day she got the keys, and I could hear the wind and her breathing and the particular quality of quiet that happens when a person is standing in front of something that's genuinely theirs for the first time. "How does it feel?" I asked. "Terrifying," she said, "and really, really good." "That's how it's supposed to feel," I said. She planted things in that backyard. She got the car she'd been meaning to get for 3 years. Reliable, not showy, the sensible choice of a woman who had made the wrong choice of car before because she bought cheap and had learned her lesson. She continued teaching 3rd grade, continued writing herd on Marcus and his complicated relationship with mathematics, continued coming to her classroom early and staying late because that was simply who she was. And $17 million did not have the power to change who a person fundamentally is. But she also set up something I did not expect and which I found out about only when she called to tell me it was real and funded and open for applications. She called it the Bennett Fund. I did not know she was going to name it that, and when she told me on the phone, I had to set the call down for a moment and look at the ceiling of my Fort Worth apartment. It was a scholarship program for elementary-aged children in underfunded school districts, the kind of districts Claire had taught in, the kind that made do with not enough of everything and still somehow produced children who were curious and bright and hungry for more than the system was giving them. The fund provided educational support, school supplies, after-school program access, and a small annual scholarship toward college preparation starting in middle school. The first cohort was 12 kids. The second would be 25. Claire had partnered with 3 school districts and a nonprofit administrator she trusted, and a board that included 2 of her former colleagues and a retired educator she'd admired for years. She had done all of it herself, with a lawyer she hired and Gerald's advisory guidance, and she had not told me until it was done because she knew I would try to help and she wanted it to be hers. "The Bennett Fund," I said when I could speak again. "Yeah," she said. There was a smile in her voice. "I figured we could use a better association with that name." I laughed. It came out rougher than I expected, the way things do when they're real. I am 60 years old. I have a clean scan and a Sunday routine and an apartment with a balcony and a view of a park where kids ride bicycles too fast and recover with grace. I have a daughter 10 minutes away who named a scholarship fund after our family and teaches third grade with the same steady quality of attention she once brought to sitting beside my hospital bed. I have a son I am learning again, slowly, imperfectly, in the way you relearn a skill after a long absence, fumbling at first, then steadier, never quite the same as before, but perhaps something different that earns its own kind of value. I have an ex-wife who said she hoped my next chapter was better, and who meant it, I believe, in the genuine and limited way that a person can mean something after the trust between them has been used up. Diana is living her life in San Angelo. She has a garden now, which she'd always wanted and we'd never gotten around to, and the last mutual acquaintance I spoke to said she seemed well. I'm glad of that. I mean it in the same genuine and limited way. And I have this. Whatever this is, the accounting, the looking back, the trying to say what happened and what it meant. I have thought a lot about what I would have done differently. That's a question that follows a man through the second half of his life like a shadow that changes length but never goes away. I would have paid more attention to the silence that followed the risks. I would have let Claire carry less of things alone for fewer years before I let her in. I would have said out loud to Ethan, when he was still young enough for it to land differently, that my failures were not his inheritance, and he didn't have to spend his whole life running from them. I would have been braver with the people I loved when bravery was required, and less brave with the deals that didn't deserve it. But I've also learned, slowly in the way all real learning comes slowly, and usually costs something you weren't expecting to pay, that you do not get to have the second chance without the first failure. The two come as a set. You cannot import the wisdom and leave behind the cost that purchased it. And the cost for me was a decade of shame and a 70-acre piece of land that everyone had given up on, including me. That land is gone now. A commercial development sits on it, or will soon. The Meridian people have already broken ground, according to what I read in the county records online. The scrubland is being graded and shaped into something new, and the old wrong that was done to it, the runoff, the contamination, the years of legal freeze, has been remediated and filed away in a county archive somewhere. What the land left behind is this: a trust that paid off a daughter's loan and bought a house with a backyard that needed work and funded a scholarship for 12 children who became 25. Not a bad legacy for 70 acres of West Texas dirt that everyone thought was worthless. My father used to say that land remembers you even after you forget yourself. I have thought about that a lot this year. I think he was right, but not exactly in the way he meant it. It wasn't the land that remembered me. It was Claire. She remembered who I was on the nights I forgot. She showed up when showing up was inconvenient and expensive, and the bus ride was 45 minutes each way in the rain. She held on to something in me that I had stopped being able to hold on to myself. That is what I want to say to anyone who is sitting somewhere right now feeling like a failure. Feeling like the thing you believed in didn't work out, and the people who were supposed to stand beside you have found better things to do with their time. Some things stay frozen for a long time. Some investments in people, in places, in your own unfinished self. They sit there for years generating nothing but paperwork and doubt, and everyone around you makes their quiet peace with the loss and moves on. And it is just you and the thing you can't stop believing in even when you can no longer explain why. And then one day a letter comes, or a phone call, or a knock on the door, or a moment across a kitchen table, or a voice on the other end of the line that says, "Tell me everything," and means it. And you find out that some things don't stay frozen forever. You find out that the person who showed up is still there. You find out that what you thought was the end of your story was just the chapter that made everything after it possible. I am Walter Bennett. I am 60 years old. I lost everything once, and I found something worth more on the other side. And the one thing I know for certain, the one thing I will carry until I can't carry anything anymore, is that the person who stands beside you when you have nothing is worth more than all the people who celebrate you when you have everything. Hold on to that person. Be that person when someone else needs it. Because the math of a life does not resolve in dollars. It resolves in the faces that are there when you open your eyes. And that, finally, is the only fortune worth having.